It was an ordinary Wednesday morning in the quiet town of Maplewood. Jake Carter, the local radio DJ, was in his small, cluttered studio, sipping his coffee and setting up for his daily show. Jake had been the voice of the town's beloved morning melodies for over a decade. His deep, calming voice was a staple for many, and his knack for weaving nostalgic anecdotes with classic hits made him a community favorite. The show was a comfort for the older crowd and a gentle backdrop for younger listeners who had grown up with it. Jake's life was simple, predictable, and for the most part, satisfying. That is, until that fateful morning when everything changed. The day started like any other. Jake queued up a playlist of old favorites, including "Story of My Life," a song that had become a sort of anthem for the town after its release. It was a song people often requested, a bittersweet melody that evoked memories of love, loss, and resilience. For Jake, it was personal. His late wife, Emily, had loved the song, and he'd played it at her memorial service years ago. It was a connection he shared with his listeners, and playing it always brought a quiet sense of warmth to his show. As the first chorus faded into the bridge, the studio phone rang. Jake glanced at the blinking red light. Caller requests were common, but something about this call felt different. He hesitated for a moment before picking up. "Good morning, you're live on Morning Melodies," Jake said, his tone cheerful but measured. There was a pause on the other end, then a gravelly voice spoke. "Jake Carter?" "Yes, this is Jake," he replied, his cheerfulness dimming slightly at the caller's somber tone. "I need to tell you something. Something about that song you just played. Story of My Life." The voice cracked slightly, a mix of urgency and hesitation. Jake leaned forward, intrigued. "Go on," he urged, lowering the studio music slightly to focus on the call. "It's not just a song," the caller said, his voice now trembling. "It's connected to something that happened here. In Maplewood. Years ago. Something nobody talks about anymore." Jake frowned, his mind racing. "What do you mean? What happened?" The caller hesitated again, and for a moment, Jake thought he might hang up. But then he spoke, each word heavy with emotion. "It's about the festival. The Maplewood Music Festival. The year it ended, and why it ended." Jake's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't thought about the Maplewood Music Festival in years. It had been the town's biggest annual event, drawing visitors from across the state. But 2 decades ago, it had abruptly stopped, with no official explanation given. Rumors had circulated, some said it was financial trouble, others whispered about a tragedy, but nothing was ever confirmed. "Are you saying there's a connection between the song and the festival?" Jake asked, his voice low. "Yes," the caller replied. "And your wife? Emily?" Jake froze. His grip tightened on the phone, his mind scrambling to process what he'd just heard. Emily? How could she be connected to this? She'd never mentioned anything about the festival, at least not in any way that seemed significant. "Who is this?" Jake demanded, his voice sharp now. The caller sighed. "I can't say. Not yet. But if you want to know the truth, meet me. Tonight. At the old festival grounds. I'll explain everything." Before Jake could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, his heart pounding. The old festival grounds? The place had been abandoned for years, left to decay as the town moved on. What could possibly be there now? And why had this stranger brought up Emily? The rest of the show passed in a blur. Jake played his usual songs and took a few more calls, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that this call was more than just a prank or a random conspiracy theory. Something about the caller's voice, its raw emotion, its desperation, convinced him that there was truth behind the words. As the clock struck noon and the show ended, Jake sat in the empty studio, staring out the window. The town stretched out before him, bathed in the golden light of late morning. It looked the same as it always did, peaceful, unassuming. But now, Jake couldn't help but feel that beneath the surface lay secrets he had never imagined. By the time evening rolled around, Jake had made up his mind. He grabbed a flashlight, a notebook, and his old leather jacket before heading out. The festival grounds were on the outskirts of town, a sprawling field surrounded by woods. As he drove, memories of Emily flooded his mind. Her laugh, her kindness, the way she used to sing along to "Story of My Life" while they cooked dinner. He had so many questions, and for the first time in years, he felt a strange mix of hope and fear. When Jake arrived, the air was cool and still. The old festival grounds were eerily quiet, the remnants of past celebrations barely visible in the overgrown grass and crumbling structures. He stepped out of the car, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, and waited. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Just as he began to doubt the caller's intentions, he heard footsteps. Turning, Jake saw a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a man, older than Jake had expected, with tired eyes and a weathered face. "You came," the man said, his voice softer now but still carrying the weight of years. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The man stepped closer, the beam of light revealing a face etched with sorrow. "My name doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is what I'm about to tell you. About Emily. About the song. And about the festival." Jake's heart raced as the man began to speak, his words unraveling a story that would change everything Jake thought he knew about his wife, his town, and the song that had meant so much to him. Jake stood frozen, his flashlight illuminating the man's weathered face. The stranger's eyes held a mix of exhaustion and urgency, as though he had carried the weight of a long-buried truth for far too long. The cool evening air pressed in around them, and the distant rustle of leaves seemed to echo the tension in Jake's chest. "You said this has to do with Emily in the festival," Jake said, his voice firm but tinged with unease. "Start talking. What's going on?" The man nodded, exhaling deeply before speaking. "You probably don't remember me. Most people in this town don't. I left Maplewood after the festival ended. Couldn't bear to stay. My name's Daniel Harris. I used to be one of the festival organizers." Jake furrowed his brow, trying to place the name. It rang a faint bell, but the memories were hazy. The festival had been such a long time ago, and he hadn't been particularly involved in its inner workings. "I worked behind the scenes," Daniel continued. "Logistics, ticketing, that sort of thing. But that last year, things were different. Tense. We were planning the biggest festival yet, bigger acts, bigger crowds. We thought it'd put Maplewood on the map. But there were whispers, warnings that something was off. At first, we dismissed them as rumors. But then, a week before the festival, we got a letter." Jake's pulse quickened. "What kind of letter?" Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. He handed it to Jake, who opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat but urgent, as though the writer had taken great care to ensure their message was clear. Jake read the words slowly, his breath catching in his throat. "Cancel the festival. People will get hurt. The signs are there if you look. Don't ignore them." Jake's hands shook slightly as he lowered the letter. "What signs? What does this mean?" Daniel sighed. "We didn't know. That's why we ignored it. We thought it was just someone trying to stir up trouble. But then..." He hesitated, his voice faltering. Then the stage collapsed during setup. 3 workers were injured, one of them seriously. It was like a warning shot, but we were stubborn. We patched things up and kept going. The festival had to happen, we had too much riding on it. Jake's mind reeled. He had heard about the stage collapse years ago, but it had been framed as an unfortunate accident, not part of some larger pattern. "What does this have to do with Emily?" he asked, his voice tight. Daniel looked down, his expression heavy with guilt. "I didn't realize it at the time, but I later learned that Emily was the one who wrote the letter. She saw something the rest of us didn't." Jake felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. Emily? His Emily? The thought of her being involved in this mysterious warning was almost too much to process. "How do you know it was her?" he demanded. Daniel hesitated, then reached into his pocket again and produced another paper. This one was smaller, a torn scrap of notebook paper. Jake recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Emily's. The note was simple, just a few words scribbled hastily. "Don't let it happen. It's not safe." Jake stared at the note, memories of Emily flooding his mind. She had always been intuitive, sensitive to things others overlooked. But she had never mentioned anything about the festival being dangerous. Why had she kept this from him? "There's more," Daniel said, pulling Jake from his thoughts. After the stage collapse, things kept going wrong. Equipment failures, sudden illnesses among the crew, even freak weather. It was like the universe was trying to stop us. And then, on the first night of the festival, the real disaster struck. Jake's heart pounded. He had heard about the incident that ended the festival, but the details had always been murky. "The fire," he said quietly. Daniel nodded grimly. "The fire. It started near the vendor tents, spread faster than anyone could react. People panicked, running in every direction. No one knows exactly how it started, but we lost 2 lives that night. And dozens were injured. It was chaos." Jake's throat tightened. He remembered the fire vividly, not because he had been there, but because Emily had come home that night shaken, unable to speak for hours. She had told him she was fine, that she hadn't been near the fire, but now he wondered what she had really seen. "After the fire, the festival was shut down for good," Daniel continued. "And I left town. But before I did, I found something that's haunted me ever since." He reached into his coat once more, pulling out a cassette tape. It was old and worn, the label faded, but Jake could just make out the words written in black marker, "Story of my life." Jake's eyes widened. "What is this?" "It's a demo," Daniel said. "The song you play on your show, it started as a demo by a local songwriter. He was one of the victims of the fire. I found this tape in the wreckage, near where the fire started. I think he knew something was going to happen. And I think Emily did, too." Jake's mind raced as he stared at the tape. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The song that had become so deeply intertwined with his life, the song that reminded him of Emily, was connected to this tragedy in ways he had never imagined. "Why are you telling me this now?" Jake asked, his voice raw. Daniel's expression softened. "Because the truth deserves to be known. And because I think Emily tried to protect this town in a way no one realized. She saw something we didn't, and it's time people understood that." Jake looked at the tape, then back at Daniel. The questions swirled in his mind, each one more pressing than the last. But one thing was clear, this story was far from over. Jake sat in his car outside the festival grounds, the cassette tape clutched tightly in his hand. The weight of Daniel's revelations bore down on him like an unrelenting storm. Emily, the festival, the song, everything seemed to be woven together in a tangled web he couldn't yet unravel. He stared at the worn tape, its faded label barely legible in the dim light of his dashboard. "Story of my life." What secrets did it hold? Could it provide the answers he desperately sought? He needed to hear it. Jake drove straight to the radio station. The town was quiet at this hour, its streets bathed in the yellow glow of streetlights. As he pulled into the station's parking lot, memories of Emily swirled in his mind. Her laughter, her curiosity, the way she always seemed to notice things others didn't. He felt a pang of guilt for not seeing her struggles more clearly when she was alive. Had she carried this burden alone? Inside the station, the hum of equipment filled the silence. Jake slid the tape into the deck, his hands trembling slightly. With a click, the machine whirred to life, and a raw, unpolished recording began to play. The song was unmistakably "Story of My Life," but this version was different, stripped down, haunting, and deeply personal. A male voice, rich with emotion, sang the familiar lyrics. Jake listened intently, the words taking on a new resonance as he connected them to the tragedy Daniel had described. Halfway through, the song shifted. The melody faltered, replaced by a low rustling sound, followed by muffled voices. Jake leaned closer, straining to make out the words. "Not safe. They won't listen. But I have to try." The voice was faint but clear enough to send a chill down Jake's spine. It wasn't the singer, it was someone else, someone speaking urgently, as if leaving a message. He rewound the tape and played the section again, this time catching more. "Emily said it would happen. She saw it coming." Jake's breath caught. Emily. Her name was on the tape. But why? And what had she seen? The tape ended abruptly, the final moments filled with static. Jake sat back, his mind racing. The voice on the tape, was it the songwriter? Had he recorded this message before the fire? And how had Emily known what was coming? The questions burned in his mind, but he knew he wouldn't find answers sitting alone in the studio. He needed to dig deeper. The next morning, Jake began his investigation in earnest. He started by combing through the station's archives, looking for anything related to the Maplewood Music Festival. Old flyers, recordings of interviews, news segments, it was all there, buried in a dusty cabinet that hadn't been touched in years. As he sifted through the materials, a pattern began to emerge. The festival's final year had been marked by a series of strange incidents, equipment malfunctions, unexplained delays, and the stage collapse Daniel had mentioned. But there was something else, something that sent a shiver down Jake's spine, a series of anonymous letters sent to the festival organizers in the weeks leading up to the event. Each one contained a warning, similar to the one Daniel had shown him. Jake scrutinized the handwriting on the letters, comparing it to Emily's note. The similarity was undeniable. She had tried to warn them. But why had she kept it a secret from him? Determined to uncover more, Jake turned to the town's newspaper archives. The Maplewood Chronicle had covered the festival extensively, and he hoped its records would provide additional clues. As he flipped through old issues, he found an article about the fire. The story was vague, focusing on the aftermath rather than the cause. However, buried in the text was a detail that caught his attention. The fire had started near the songwriter's tent, the very spot where Daniel had found the cassette tape. Jake's next stop was the town library, where he searched for records on the festival's original organizers. He discovered that the songwriter, Mark Hensley, had been a rising star in the local music scene. Known for his introspective lyrics and haunting melodies, Mark had been the festival's headlining act that year. But what struck Jake most was a photograph he found in an old program booklet. It showed Mark and Emily standing together, smiling, their arms slung around each other's shoulders. Jake stared at the photo, his heart pounding. Emily had never mentioned Mark to him. How had they known each other? And why had she never talked about him or the festival? He was so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice the librarian standing nearby. "That's a sad story," she said, nodding toward the photo. Mark Hensley and Emily Carter. They were close, you know. Some say they were more than just friends. Jake's stomach turned. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice strained. The librarian hesitated. "I'm not one to gossip, but there were rumors back then. People said Emily and Mark were working on something together, a song, maybe. She was always at the festival grounds that summer, helping him. They seemed inseparable. But after the fire, she never talked about him again. It was like she wanted to erase it all. Jake thanked the librarian and left the library, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. Could Emily have been involved in creating Story of My Life? Had she known about the dangers of the festival because of her connection to Mark? And if so, why had she buried the truth? Back at home, Jake sat in his living room, surrounded by the materials he'd gathered. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but he still didn't have the full picture. As he stared at the photo of Emily and Mark, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small notebook in Mark's hand. It looked identical to the one Emily used to carry everywhere. Jake remembered how she'd scribble notes and sketches in it, always saying it was where she kept her thoughts. Jake's heart raced as a sudden realization hit him. If Emily's notebook still existed, it might hold the answers he was looking for. But where was it? He tore through the house, searching every drawer, every box, every dusty corner. Finally, in the back of their bedroom closet, he found it, tucked inside an old shoebox filled with her belongings. The notebook was worn, its cover cracked from years of use. Jake opened it with trembling hands, flipping through pages of notes and drawings. Near the back, he found something that made his breath hitch: lyrics. Familiar, haunting lyrics. They were the words to Story of My Life. But these weren't Mark's. They were Emily's handwriting. Jake sat down, the notebook open in his lap, as a wave of emotions crashed over him. Emily hadn't just known Mark, she had been part of his music. She had helped create the song that had become a cornerstone of his life. And yet, she had kept it all hidden. Why? As Jake stared at the notebook, he noticed a final entry written just days before the festival. The words were hurried, almost frantic. Mark says we have to warn them, but no one's listening. I've done all I can. If something happens, I hope this song will tell our story. The truth can't stay buried forever. Tears blurred Jake's vision as he read the words. Emily had tried to protect the town, to stop the tragedy she and Mark had seen coming. But she had also carried the weight of their failure, keeping the truth locked away even from him. Jake closed the notebook, his resolve hardening. The truth was out there, and he owed it to Emily, and to the town, to uncover it. But as he prepared to dig deeper, a chilling thought struck him: what if the truth wasn't just buried in the past? What if it was still shaping the present? Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the events of the past were not as far removed from the present as they seemed. He sat in his car outside the town's historical society, the notebook resting on the passenger seat beside him. Emily's frantic last entry echoed in his mind: the truth can't stay buried forever. The weight of her words pushed him forward, even as doubt and unease clawed at his resolve. Inside, the historical society was eerily quiet, the scent of old books and aged wood thick in the air. Jake explained his purpose to the archivist, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She led him to a small room filled with boxes of festival memorabilia. "This is what we have," she said curtly, gesturing to the neatly labeled boxes. "The festival files haven't been touched in years. Let me know if you need anything." With that, she left Jake alone. Jake began sifting through the boxes, his movements quick but methodical. He found old posters, financial records, vendor contracts, and handwritten meeting minutes from the festival committee. As he flipped through the pages, a pattern began to emerge, something unsettling. Among the mundane details of festival planning were repeated mentions of disruptions and unusual delays. One meeting note from just days before the fire caught his attention. Concerns raised about safety measures. Emily Carter voiced strong objections to continuing without further precautions. Motion dismissed by majority vote. Jake's stomach churned. Emily had tried to stop the festival, but no one had listened. The minutes painted a picture of a young woman standing against a tide of indifference, her warnings dismissed as paranoia. It was clear she had been fighting a losing battle, but why had she been so certain something terrible would happen? As he reached the bottom of one of the boxes, Jake uncovered a folder labeled Incident Reports. Inside were detailed accounts of the strange occurrences leading up to the festival, electrical malfunctions, unexplained power surges, and equipment failures that defied logical explanation. One report stood out, a statement from a sound technician who had worked with Mark Hensley. Mark mentioned feeling uneasy about the festival. Said he'd been having vivid dreams about fire and destruction. He was convinced something bad was going to happen, but he wouldn't explain why. Seemed distracted and anxious during rehearsals. Jake leaned back in his chair, the pieces beginning to align. Mark's unease, Emily's warnings, and the cryptic messages on the cassette tape all pointed to a shared knowledge of an impending disaster. But what had they seen or experienced that made them so certain? Jake was about to close the folder when he noticed a small envelope tucked into the back. Inside was a grainy photograph of Mark standing in the festival's main tent, a large chalkboard behind him covered in scribbled notes and diagrams. Jake's eyes narrowed as he studied the image. The words on the chalkboard were difficult to make out, but one phrase was clear: "They'll pay the price if we're ignored." Jake's pulse quickened. What did that mean? And who were they? Determined to find answers, Jake returned to the festival grounds that evening. The site was overgrown with weeds and littered with remnants of its former glory, rusted tent poles, broken benches, and faded signs. He walked toward the spot where the main stage had once stood, guided by memory and the faint outline of the structure's foundation. As he stood there, the air seemed heavier, charged with an unsettling energy. Jake crouched down, running his hand over the cracked concrete. A glint of metal caught his eye, and he brushed away the dirt to reveal a small plaque embedded in the ground. The inscription was simple but chilling. "In memory of those we lost. May their voices never be silenced." Jake felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't known about the plaque, it wasn't something the town had ever publicly acknowledged. It was as though the memory of the festival, and the fire, had been deliberately buried. As he rose to leave, a voice stopped him in his tracks. "You shouldn't be here." Jake turned sharply, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, his silhouette partially obscured by the tall grass. It was Daniel. "What are you doing here?" Jake demanded. "I could ask you the same thing," Daniel replied, stepping closer. His expression was grim. "You're digging into something you don't understand." Jake squared his shoulders. "Then help me understand. You came to me with the tape, Daniel. You wanted me to know the truth." Daniel hesitated, his gaze flickering to the plaque. "I wanted you to know what Emily did for this town. But the truth, the full truth, it's not something you can just uncover without consequences." Jake felt a surge of frustration. Enough with the cryptic warnings. "What are you afraid of? What aren't you telling me?" Daniel sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "You think this was just about the festival, don't you? About bad luck or negligence?" It wasn't. There was something darker at play. Jake frowned. "What are you talking about?" Daniel glanced around, as if ensuring they were alone. Then he leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mark wasn't just a songwriter. He was connected to something. A group, a belief, I don't know what to call it. They thought music had power, real power. Not just to move people, but to shape reality. Mark believed the festival would amplify that power. But when things started going wrong, he thought they'd miscalculated. That the energy they were tapping into wasn't what they'd expected." Jake's heart pounded. "You're saying Mark caused the fire?" Daniel shook his head. "Not intentionally. But he and Emily knew something was building, something dangerous. That's why she tried to stop it. But by then, it was too late. Jake stared at Daniel, trying to process his words. It sounded absurd, like something out of a conspiracy theory. And yet, the pieces fit in a way that was deeply unsettling. "If you know all this, why didn't you tell anyone?" Jake asked. Daniel's expression darkened. "Because no one would have believed me. And because the people who knew the truth, really knew it, they're either gone or too scared to talk." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "What about the tape? What's on it?" Daniel hesitated, then said, "It's a fragment. A glimpse of what Mark was trying to do. But it's incomplete. If you're serious about finding the truth, you need to find the rest of his work. The other recordings." Jake nodded, his resolve hardening. "Where do I start?" Daniel pointed toward the far end of the clearing. "There's an old storage shed near the edge of the property. That's where they kept the festival's equipment. If anything's left, it'll be there." Jake thanked him and made his way to the shed, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The structure was barely standing, its wooden walls warped and cracked from years of neglect. Jake forced the door open, the hinges creaking loudly. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of mildew. Jake scanned the room, his beam landing on a stack of crates in the corner. He pried one open, revealing a jumble of old cables and microphones. As he dug deeper, his hand brushed against something solid, a small wooden box. He lifted it carefully, his pulse quickening as he opened it. Inside was a collection of tapes, each labeled in Mark's handwriting. One stood out, "Final Mix, Do Not Play." Jake stared at the tape, his fingers trembling. This was it. The missing piece. But as he held it, a deep sense of foreboding washed over him. What had Mark left behind? And was Jake prepared to face it? Jake held the tape delicately, as if it might crumble under the weight of its own secrets. "Final Mix, Do Not Play." The label sent a chill through him, a warning both cryptic and ominous. He slid it into his jacket pocket, feeling its presence like a lead weight against his chest. The dilapidated shed creaked ominously as the wind howled outside, urging him to leave. Whatever answers the tape held, they would not be found here. Back at the radio station, the dim glow of the equipment cast long shadows across the room. The station had always been a place of comfort for Jake, a haven where music was the language and stories unfolded with the push of a button. Tonight, it felt different. The air seemed charged with anticipation, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Jake set the tape on the desk, staring at it as if it might come alive on its own. He debated his next move. The label's warning gnawed at him. Should he listen to it alone? Share it with someone who could help him understand? Or perhaps leave it untouched, preserving whatever mystery it contained? The answers felt tantalizingly close yet terrifyingly out of reach. Taking a deep breath, he slid the tape into the deck. The familiar whir of the machine sent a shiver down his spine. With a click, the recording began to play. At first, it was quiet, just the soft hiss of static, like a restless whisper in the dark. Then came the music. The melody was haunting, even more stripped down than the previous tape. It was unmistakably story of my life, but this version was raw, unpolished, as though it had been recorded in the heat of an emotional storm. Jake closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him, each note a thread pulling him deeper into Mark Hensley's world. Then, midway through the song, the recording shifted. The music faded into the background, replaced by a voice. It was Mark, speaking with a quiet intensity that sent a chill down Jake's spine. "If you're hearing this," Mark said, his voice wavering slightly, "it means I didn't make it. It means the fire, it means we failed." Jake's pulse quickened. He leaned closer to the speakers, hanging on every word. "This song, it's not just music. It's a map. A warning. Emily and I thought we could use it to stop what was coming, but we underestimated what we were dealing with. They told us we were playing with fire, and they were right. We didn't know the cost." Mark's voice cracked, heavy with regret. Emily was the brave one. She tried to warn them, even when no one would listen. She believed we could fix it, that the song could undo the damage. But the forces we awakened, they weren't interested in balance. They wanted chaos. Destruction. The tape hissed again, and for a moment, Jake thought it had ended. But then Mark's voice returned, quieter now, as though speaking from a great distance. "If you're still listening, you need to know, this isn't over. The fire was just the beginning. They're still out there, waiting, feeding on the energy we unleashed. If you find this, you have to stop it. Finish what we started. Before it's too late." The tape ended with a sharp click, leaving Jake in stunned silence. The weight of Mark's words hung heavy in the room, their implications both staggering and terrifying. The fire wasn't an accident. It was the result of something far darker, something that hadn't been extinguished with the flames. Jake replayed the tape, searching for hidden clues in Mark's words. He felt as though he were standing at the edge of a precipice, staring into an abyss of unanswered questions. What had Mark and Emily unleashed? And who, or what, was still out there, waiting? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the station door. The sound startled him, breaking the heavy silence. The days that followed were a blur of obsession for Jake. He barely ate, barely slept, consumed by the mystery surrounding Mark Hensley, Emily Carter, and the forces that seemed to ripple through the town like an unseen storm. The final tape had opened a door, and Jake couldn't unsee what lay beyond. He spent hours scouring the Historical Society's archives, combing through newspaper articles, and chasing down anyone who might remember the festival from all those years ago. Yet, for every answer he uncovered, a dozen new questions emerged. The key, Jake was convinced, lay in Mark's cryptic words about the song being a map. But a map to what? He played the tape repeatedly, straining to catch nuances in Mark's voice, subtle shifts in the melody, or hidden layers in the recording. One night, as he listened for what felt like the 100th time, something struck him. The melody, while hauntingly beautiful, contained a pattern, an almost mathematical rhythm that didn't feel entirely natural. Jake began sketching it out on a piece of paper, translating the notes into a sequence of numbers and shapes. By dawn, the realization hit him like a thunderclap. The melody wasn't just music, it was a cipher, a code embedded within the song. The pattern pointed to a set of coordinates, a location just outside of town near the abandoned quarry. The discovery sent a shiver down his spine. The quarry had been closed for decades, shrouded in rumors of unexplained accidents and disappearances. If Mark's map was leading there, Jake knew it wasn't by coincidence. Despite his exhaustion, Jake wasted no time. He packed a flashlight, a notebook, and the tape recorder before heading out. The morning was gray and overcast, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. The quarry loomed ahead, a scar on the landscape, its jagged cliffs and stagnant pools of water giving it an almost otherworldly feel. Jake parked his car at the edge and climbed through the rusted gate that marked the entrance. The air grew colder as he descended into the quarry, the sounds of the outside world fading into an eerie silence. The coordinates led him to a narrow cave tucked into the rock face, its entrance partially obscured by overgrown brush. Jake hesitated, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. Then, steeling himself, he stepped inside. The cave was damp and dark, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. Jake's flashlight illuminated the rough walls, revealing faint markings etched into the stone. He moved closer, running his fingers over the carvings. They were symbols, strange and unfamiliar, yet they seemed to resonate with the same rhythm as Mark's music. Further in, the walls opened into a small chamber. At its center stood a makeshift altar, constructed from stones and adorned with objects that made Jake's stomach turn: burned candles, scraps of paper with illegible scrawls, and a tattered notebook that looked disturbingly familiar. Jake picked up the notebook, his hands trembling. The cover bore Mark's name, the pages filled with his handwriting. The notes were erratic, alternating between detailed sketches of musical patterns and frantic ramblings about energy, balance, and sacrifice. One entry, written in bold, shaky letters, caught Jake's attention: "The song must be completed, or it will claim us all." The sound of footsteps shattered the silence, and Jake spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Daniel stood at the entrance of the chamber, his face a mask of grim determination. "I warned you," Daniel said, his voice echoing off the cave walls. "You shouldn't have come here." "What is this?" Jake demanded, holding up the notebook. "What did Mark and Emily uncover?" Daniel's gaze hardened. "Something that was never meant to be found. Mark thought he could control it, that he could use music to harness the energy. But he didn't understand what he was dealing with. None of us did." "Why didn't you stop him?" Jake asked, anger rising in his chest. "I tried," Daniel said, his voice heavy with regret. "But by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. The fire was the only way to stop it." Jake stared at him, horrified. "You're saying the fire wasn't an accident? You caused it?" Daniel nodded slowly. "It was the only way to break the connection. But even that wasn't enough. The energy didn't disappear, it just went dormant. And now, thanks to you, it's stirring again." Jake's mind raced, pieces of the puzzle snapping into place. The warnings, the cryptic messages, the fire, it had all been an attempt to contain something far more dangerous than he'd imagined. But if the energy was still out there, waiting, then the song might be the only way to stop it for good. "We can still fix this," Jake said, his voice steady. "Mark said the song was the key. If we finish it." Daniel cut him off. "Do you even understand what you're saying? The song doesn't just stop the energy, it draws it in. If you make a mistake, it could unleash something far worse." Jake stepped closer, meeting Daniel's gaze. "If we do nothing, it'll destroy everything anyway. We have to try." Daniel hesitated, torn between fear and the faintest glimmer of hope. Finally, he nodded. "Then we'll do it together. But we have to be careful. One wrong note, one wrong move, and it's over." The two men worked through the day, piecing together the fragments of Mark's music from the notebook and the tapes. Jake played the melody on his guitar, each note resonating with an otherworldly power that made the air around them hum. As the final chord rang out, the cave seemed to tremble, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly before fading into darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a low rumble echoed through the chamber, and a gust of wind swept past them, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. Jake and Daniel exchanged a glance, their relief tempered by the weight of what they'd just done. "Is it over?" Jake asked. Daniel shook his head. "I don't know. But whatever happens next, at least we gave it everything we had." As they left the cave, the rain began to fall, washing away the dirt and blood and fear of the day. Jake felt a strange sense of peace, knowing he'd faced the darkness head-on. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of a story far larger than himself, a story that would ripple through the town and beyond, its echoes carried on the haunting strains of a song that would never be forgotten.